Hello. Actually, before my, 13-year detour into IBM, I was in that field. I was in digital humanities, so I'm very pleased to see how far it's come. And in some ways, the field that I find myself in now has sort of affected that same transformation. What was once called urban design, I think of now as sort of urban systems. It's really a more data-driven approach to what had largely been associated with zoning. But urban design is something I'll touch on here, as well as architecture, are really kind of rich new fields as they apply to data-driven aspects of running a city. So I am the Chief Technology Officer. I work in the Mayor's office, so not on the operational side of things, but on the policy side. And during the transition, I was on the transition team, but still sort of very happily and blindly working for IBM, blindly in the sense of what was to come. Well, actually, let me back up just a second. In December, before the mayor was elected, I don't know if you remember, if you're from Chicago, he did this L-Stop tour. So he went to every L-Stop in the city, and mine was Paulina. It was December, and it was freezing, and it was early, and I walked in, and he was standing there, and he was completely alone. And I thought, oh, here's my chance. I said, what do you think of open data? And he stared at me very blankly, and about a dozen people came in, and I could hear the train was rumbling up ahead, and he said, do you mean like for transparency and that sort of thing? And I thought, okay, I've got one chance to like put a hook in him because I know what he cares about. I said, no, actually, for saving money. And the crowd came through, and I never saw him. Well, I didn't see him again until the transition when he asked me to come in and from IBM's perspective talk about why that might be true. Now, we'll fast forward a little bit. Many politicians' view of open data is these first two. That transparency is a way of building trust, either in your electorate or in your workforce. And if they progress beyond that, it's that, it'll make our workforce more accountable, right? Performance management, things that the private sector has been doing for years. And this largely characterized, I would say, and I don't think they would disagree, that the campaign's view of what open data could do. What we've been able to do, there's also an even newer position in the city that doesn't exist elsewhere called the Chief Data Officer that also sits in the Mayor's office, is really push these last two, which is that a strategy around open data is also about analysis, both internally and for the public and anyone else, any other sort of stakeholder or constituent, to derive insight, to learn things that we didn't previously know that was actually there in plain sight if you were able to correlate different data sets. I'll give you some examples of that. And then lastly, something that is very rarely talked about, but that if you think of it in this way, you can think of all kinds of businesses actually that are built on open data. So there's only so many ways that a government can actually stimulate growth. One of those ways actually is to avail the vital signs of the systems that they track. In our case, water and transportation, public safety and education as the kind of raw materials for making new businesses. The National Weather Service or weather itself is a multi-billion-dollar industry, if you want to call it that. The data that feeds those wasn't always standardized. That was done when the National Weather Service sort of became a data service. So we think of this as an economic development tool as well as all these other things. So the real locus of this is the open data portal at data.cityofchicago.org. We have published hundreds of data sets over the past couple of months, and these are updated nightly. These are absolutely not PDFs. These are machine readable. They are open. There is a well-documented API for hooking into it, such that you don't ever actually have to come in. There's some people I know in the audience actually who build interesting applications and uses of the data that lives here. And the other important point about this is that most of these sets are updated nightly. So it's getting at a kind of real-time dashboard of the city. Here's an example of total, I believe this is total average daily traffic counts. And this is actually gathered manually, but there are other systems that we have that are sensor-based. This is a slightly out of date, but just to show you exactly how much is being created. The really salient number there is 207. I mean, this is everything from restaurant inspection data, updated nightly, which will surprise you. Crime, obviously, we published, this was the first city in the nation to publish 10 years of crime data down to the block level, updated nightly. And this all feeds into kind of a secondary area of open data called performance metrics. Now, anybody In the private sector, I can tell you that this is what it's based upon, but not many governments actually do this. And I think it's fair to say that the city of Chicago was not as open about this as it could have been. So performance metrics. This is basically taking actual indicators of how the city is interacting with a resident or a visitor. So there are very few departments that actually don't touch residents or visitors, but in this case, it's how long did it take, what is the average time per week to get a pothole filled, for instance? Average wait times at the 311 call center. Tree lights all out, rodent baiting requests. And these go every Friday to the mayor in a report where he has the opportunity to talk with the commissioners about what is or is not going well, but it's also online. So this is an open data set too and can be built upon, but this is really more about establishing a baseline that we can then re-engineer processes around. I mean, the truth is, we really didn't know how long it was taking to fill a pothole. But the other point here is that you start to see over time that there are efficiencies of scale that can take place. I mean, you start to see, if you live here, you've seen this, where certain areas of the city, certain even just stretches of block, will be ripped up multiple times in a month by different areas of the city, different departments in the city. You start to see it's very plainly balding when you're looking at it through this lens. So here's an example of average days to complete pothole repair requests. That dotted line is what CDOT, the Department of Transportation, considers acceptable, 7. This is early summer, and that real low dip there corresponds to the introduction of something called a pothole killer, which is a vehicle that squirts this, fills a pothole in just a couple seconds. So getting better. But this, scaled up a couple dozen times across the agencies is our approach to performance management. Where it gets really exciting, though, is facilitating community's involvement in the data. This is a screenshot from a hackathon that Google hosted a couple months ago at their headquarters here. Making this public is really about admitting that the city definitely doesn't have all the resources to build upon this, and that we don't have all the answers either. So one of the ways to kind of get this community going is something called Apps for Metro Chicago, which is an application development competition. There's prize money involved, funded by MacArthur, using data sets from the state, the county, and the lion's share really is from the city. There's 3 phases of it. This is the winners of the transportation round. The community round just closed, and then we're moving into this thing called the Grand Challenge. I'll show you some of these applications, and they are interesting and useful. They are smartphone apps, Facebook apps, web apps. But the real deliverable, it's clear to me now, from these competitions really isn't the applications, which will, who knows if the platforms will be supported years from now. It's the community that this develops. Again, this is almost an economic development argument, right? We brought these people together at these various hackathons, at the events, via social events that have been organized around this, and the online forums, all of whom are not only competing with one another, but they're actually sharing. All the data is open, so they're sharing ideas about how to use this piece or that piece. The winner of the transportation round was something called Spot Hero, which is actually kind of interesting. This takes city data, and then also you can rent your own parking spot in the city. So not from the city, but say from your condo association or somewhere else. And the idea the developers have behind this is that parking spot is idle, is not making you any money, is in fact costing you money every time you're out of it. So why not join a system that allows someone who's got a smartphone driving around looking for a parking space to essentially sublet or rent that paid-for parking spot for the hour or 2 that they need to be near there. So these aren't actually city-owned parking spots, but privately owned, but it uses other city data. And what's interesting about this is, presumably, this application is making money for a developer, is the foundation of a business that's built upon certain sets of data that are public to begin with. This is called In30. It's a way you put your address in, and it tells you all the things that there are to do within 30 minutes of public transit, 30 minutes walking, 30 minutes biking. I'm not sure if this is where you got the data from, but this is called ChicagoLobbyist.org. This is really interesting, actually. The developer of which, one of the developers, which is in the audience here, that takes a raw and pretty unwieldy set of data that is so full of stories and insight, and puts it into a really easy-to-use way. So this is, who's influencing whom. They haven't yet gotten to the end goal, I think, which they've even stated, which is to look at what the legislative outcome is of this kind of influence. You can think of this as almost an inverse social network, where what you're tracking is legislative influence rather than likes and dislikes. It's extremely useful. It's super simple, but very, very easy. If you're from Chicago, you know that the streets are swept. This allows you to put your address in or your cell phone number, and then the night before your zone is swept, it will send you a text message or email to tell you to get your car off the street so that you'll get a ticket. Very easy. Even easier than that, the same developer, a guy named Scott Robin, this thing does one thing. You put your address in, and you don't want valid results from that. But if it is, if you have been towed, it shows you where your car is in the lot. And this is just sitting up on top of a data set that's updated nightly about car towing. Couldn't be simpler. These are the kinds of intuitive interfaces, actually, that people understand and that we think of as just as important as what it feels like, to be in, a city revenue office or to be, dealing with your postman or something like that. These are also interfaces to the built environment. This is one called Chicago Rat Watch that plots, none of these, by the way, built by the city, but built on top of city data, that plots rat reports against baiting locations and then moves through time, okay? So you start to see these sort of rodent migrations, which is interesting when it starts to be, what I haven't seen yet, but what I'd love to see is to plot restaurant inspection data on this, to plot abandonment and blight data on this, right? Because now you start to see the sort of interconnected system here. Maybe there are indicators, early indicators of a blighted neighborhood, right? I'm not saying that the rats are the canaries in the coal mine, but they might be. And anything that can get us sort of an advanced intervention point to any outcome that is undesirable for the city, we're looking at, including rats. So how are we using this to make city government more efficient? One is we're using internal analytics around fraud detection. There's a really interesting sort of a statistical law called Benford's Law that basically predicts a pretty even distribution of digits. I won't go into what it is, but if you Google it, it's really interesting. And it's usually used in fraud detection in polling, but it's equally useful in where you have large sets of like credit card transactions and things like that. We're doing it for social media analysis. So basically we have access to what Twitter calls the Firehose API, which is an insane amount of data every second, and geolocating that to the boundaries of the city, and then looking for certain keywords. Okay, and this is scripted. We're not actually using this, but I had no good graphic. It's just a command line graphic. Looking for keywords. So where we see food poisoning, for instance, show up, that gets flagged and sent to the Chicago Department of Public Health for an inspector to look into. We've caught a number of potholes and, in fact, sinkholes this way. The real beauty of this will come next year when we implement something called Open 311, which is an open application programming interface to the 311 database, so that these things can trigger service requests automatically. So think of it this way. There's an application in Boston that we very much admire called Bump. What it is it's a smartphone application that you just let run in the background. You don't have to interact with it in any way. And if you're on a bike or if you're in your car and it feels a significant enough jostle on its accelerometer, it flags that GPS and sends it off and says this is a potential pothole. And then what happens is the service request is not triggered until 10 or more of those get triggered, because it could potentially, it's also checked against the database that contains speed humps and things like that. I mean, you may have run over a dog or a small child. So it would be as well. But this kind of the usage of the populace as ambient sensors in a way, right? Or at least the devices that they carry is very interesting to us. I alluded to this a little bit in talking about rodents as early indicators. Where this is all really leading is neighborhood analytics. The ability to tie multiple indicators together to allow us a sort of predictive framework to plot the probability curves that one or another thing will happen in a neighborhood. We started this in some very rudimentary ways by looking at the data that we have on where Meals on Wheels are delivered versus where we know that there's one inhabitant of the house based on tax records that would lead you to a couple of common sense assumptions for intervention in heat waves and snow emergencies. Basically, you know that this person is infirm or elderly, that there was only one person there. But that could lead to other insight too. Not that it absolutely would happen, but that it should be flagged that this home has a potential to fall into disrepair, could fall to blight. Blight is, as a thing, is a very fast-moving phenomenon. Once you see that in your neighborhood, you start to question the value of your own house, and it spreads in a pattern that is vaguely epidemiological. And so, this is really the goal. And the goal, ultimately, is better service, a more livable Chicago, but to identify places where we can intervene earlier. We've got some 3D visualization. If you've been just down the way or up the way here on Michigan Avenue, the Chicago Architecture Foundation has a digital model that's been fabricated of the Central Business District and then a little bit north. These were all made from SketchUp files, so Google SketchUp, and we've got access to these, and we believe that there are some uses of 3D visualization of the geo data sets that we have. This, for instance, is LEED certified buildings in the loop. But where this is pushing, this is also pushing to something called the city as a platform. And I'll end by noting one of the places I think Chicago is taking a bit of a lead here. If you think about the public way, so public plazas and sidewalk and things like that, this is where my sort of dilettante urbanism comes in. There's a lot of network architecture and technology in the physical public way. You've got 4,500 parking meters, which, say what you will about the parking meter deal, these are computers. These are network nodes, solar powered, and they're completely underutilized given what's in those. We've got these solar compactors throughout the Central Business District, which you may not know, those are on the internet too. I see when they are full, but no one else does, or very few other people beyond the people who empty them see that. We have digital and interactive wayfinding and journey planning coming to bus shelters. You've already seen at some of the L stops those kinds of screens. And then you may have read that the city just issued an RFP for public bike share along the lines of DC and London and Paris. Those have to be on the internet. And then there's all the stuff that citizens never see, which is the irrigation systems and the streetscaping and the traffic signals and things like that. None of those things are talking to one another. They are not integrated in any way, and more concerning to me is outside of the public safety realm, they're not public in any way. These things partake of the digital public way, but you can't access them. You can't build on top of them like you could if you had the skills and the desire, build on top of that open data portal. So what we're thinking about is a digital public way that is as open to inquiry as this sign. Now this is extremely low tech, but conceptually it's the right way to do it. You may have never noticed this. On the bus stop signs, there's a short SMS short code. So if you don't have a smartphone, you can just text, I don't even know what that number is, but you can text CTA bus and that number, and it'll tell you the next buses that are coming. What you are doing in concept is querying a piece of public infrastructure. What you're doing in practice is sending a thing over the network and it's going back. But it's this idea of direct interaction with a piece of public architecture. That scaled up to all the pieces of the public way, the city fleet. Some cities have actually done this. Walk up to a city vehicle, query it via near-field communication or QR code or something like that, and it'll tell you what the schedule is for the day. That kind of openness is actually, I think, the next step in a really transparent municipal government. So, and leads to all kinds of interesting public signage that's more than just when the bus is coming. Ambient data, service discovery that's very local, hyper-local to where you are, in addition to wayfinding and journey planning. So I'll leave you just with this scene. You've got this woman who's walking down the sidewalk. You see it every day, millions of times a day in a city. You've got a person who's simultaneously doing all kinds of things. She's probably not going to get hit by that biker. She's probably not being stalked, but it's not totally clear. But she is doing, she's at least navigating two separate interfaces at the same time. The built environment, the skin of the built world, something that architects and urban planners do, design, and the interface of the phone, which I would suggest to you is no less valid an interface or a way of experiencing a city. My challenge to you and my experience over the last couple of years is that the two communities of practice that partake of these design fields are not really talking. The urban designers and architects and people doing the interface design. Now that may not be the case at the Institute of Design, Mr. Basham, but it is in some other places. By and large, the architects, the designers of the built world and industrial designers have been doing it for a very long time and figured out a lot of problems that I see being resolved, in many cases poorly, in interface design. So, if I have one message to leave to you, it should be thinking about urban systems very holistically. It is a brick and mortar thing, but also a digital thing. So some of the work that we're working on are so all this data is out there. Some of the criticism, muted though it has been that, it's a junk drawer or it's democracy by spreadsheet, it's no more useful than having no data at all. I think that is a consequence of changing definitions of journalism. When we released this 10 years of crime data, a lot of journalists called up and said, thank you so much for publishing this, we've been asking about it forever. Tell us where the stories are in the data. I said, absolutely not. And that's assuming I know in 1.7 million rows of data where the interesting bits are. But also, shouldn't that be the definition of journalism? A sort of, that you possess the skills, possibly the tools, to suss that out. Now, I think some of the burden does fall on the city or the provider to provide better public tools, because not everyone is a journalist, to make sense of that data. We have the most rudimentary tools now. Mapping is one of them, but we think we could do better there, and more context around the data that lives within a website that's redesigned, that really foregrounds the sort of living nature of the city through its data visualization, rather than just, here's how you call this department, or here's how you call that department. I mentioned Open 311. That is for service requests. If you guys have used the CTA's bus tracker or train tracker, they didn't build any applications. They built an open framework that allowed others to build applications on it. So it's the same thing with 311. Imagine being able to write an app like Bump in Boston, or even just something simple that allows you to take a photo of a pothole, and away it goes and directly into the system. That doesn't happen without 311. Very closely related to something called Open FOIA. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, which consumes a lot of resources. It's a very good thing. There are 57 people in the city of Chicago whose full-time job it is to print out these documents that people request of their public officials. Much of that could be short-circuited if there was a online way to do those sorts of things. So that's my presentation. I do think there actually is an opportunity for questions afterwards at the reception. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. So that was our last official speaker for today.